In the absence of political parties, clubs were established to support the popular movement. They were set up soon after the Estates General met in May 1789. For the ordinary people, they provided a stage for which speakers could debate the great issues of the day. The majority of Frenchmen who had never been involved in political life discovered that they provided a crash course in political education. As there were no political parties, the clubs played an important part in the Revolution. They kept the public informed on the major issues of the day, supported election candidates, and acted as pressure groups to influence the deputies in the Assembly and to promote actions which the deputies seemed reluctant to undertake. In essence, they provided education in political participation. The Jacobin Club originated in meetings of radical Breton deputies with other similar views. When the Assembly moved to Paris after the October days, these deputies and their supporters rented a room from monks of a Jacobin convent, hence their name. At the club, members debated measures that were to come before the Assembly. The Jacobin Club set a high entrance fee for its members. There were about 1,200 by July 1790, and they came mainly from the wealthiest sections of society. To begin with, they associated themselves with the ideas of physiocrats who believed that landowners should control the wealth and be taxed. Jacobin ideology was based upon a combination of Enlightenment thought and revolutionary practice. They came to reject the notion of monarchy. What distinguished the Jacobin from other contemporary clubs was that they were highly political men of action. As the Jacobin moved further to the left in the summer of 1792, they favored increased centralization of government in order to defend the Republic. The key figure to emerge during this period was Maximilien Robespierre, leader of a minority group of radical Jacobin deputies. A national network of Jacobin clubs soon grew up, all linked to the Central Club in Paris, of which they regularly corresponded. By the end of 1793, there were over 2,000 Jacobin clubs across France. It has been estimated that between 1790 and 1799, the movement involved 2% of the population. The significance of the club is that they enabled for the first time large numbers of people to become directly involved in the political life of their country. The Cordeliers Club was founded in April 1790, was more radical than the Jacobin Club, and had no membership fee. It objected to the distinction between active and passive citizens and supported measures which the sans-culottes favored. They wanted direct democracy where voters chose deputies, the recall of deputies to account for their actions, the right of insurrection or rebellion if the government acted against popular wishes. It had much support among the working class, although its leaders were bourgeoisie. Georges d'Estaing and Camille Desmoulins were lawyers. Jacques-René Hebert was an unsuccessful writer who had become a journalist when freedom of press was allowed. Brissot was also a journalist, but the most notorious writer of them all was Marat, a failed doctor turned radical journalist. He hated all those who enjoyed privileges under the old regime and attacked them violently in his newspaper. He became the chief spokesman of the popular movement. During the winter of 1790 to 91, the example of the Cordeliers Club led to the formation of many popular or fraternal societies, which were soon to be found in every district in Paris and in several provincial towns. In 1791, the Cordeliers Club and popular societies formed a federation and elected a central committee. The members of the popular societies were drawn mainly from the liberal professions such as teachers and officials, and skilled artisans and shopkeepers. Laborers rarely joined as they did not have the spare time for politics. By the start of 1790, many peasants had become disillusioned with the revolution. The sense of anticipation which followed the night of August 4th quickly diminished once they realized in the spring of 1790 that their feudal dues were not abolished outright, but would have to be bought out instead. A rural revolution began in 1790 in Brittany, in central France, and in the southeast. This lasted until 1792 and placed pressure on the Jacobins. Peasants fixed the price of grain, called for the sale of church land in small lots, and attacked landowners. The rising in the Midi in 1792 was as important as any in 1789 in size and the extent of the destruction. The risings and the deteriorating military situation contributed to the most serious crisis of the Revolution. On August 10, 1792, Louis was deposed. Shortly afterwards, all feudal dues, which could not be justified, were abolished. Feudalism was finally abolished without compensation by the Jacobins on July 17, 1793. The sans-culottes were the workers in the towns. They were not a class, as they included artisans and master craftsmen who owned their own workshops, as well as wage owners. They had been responsible for the successful attack on the Bastille and for bringing the royal family back to Paris in the October days, yet they had received few rewards. Many of them were passive citizens who did not have the vote. They suffered greatly from inflation. To meet its expenses, the government printed more and more paper money, whose value therefore declined. There was a wave of strikes by workers against the falling value of their wages early in 1791. Grain prices rose by up to 50% after a poor harvest in 1791. This led to riots, which resulted in shopkeepers being forced to reduce prices. The discontent of the urban workers could be used by the popular societies, which linked economic protests to the political demand for a republic whose representatives were directly elected by the people, and by groups in the assembly who were seeking power. This made the revolution more radical in ways which the bourgeoisie leaders of 1789 had neither intended nor desired. The outstanding politician in the Constituent Assembly was Count Mirabeau, a nobleman who was elected for the Third Estate in 1789. His willingness to deal directly with the king cost him a great deal of popular support by the time of his death in April 1791. He was fairly typical of a group of moderate politicians who were becoming increasingly influential in the Assembly. Three of the leading figures were Barnave, Duport, and Lameth, who were known as the Triumvirate. Their broad aim was to try and heal the divisions between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie that had emerged during 1789. They feared the extremism of the new clubs and the emergence of organized working class movement and wished to bring the revolution to an end. In order for this to happen, there had to be a compromise with the king. This was difficult, as anyone suspected of negotiating with the king was likely to be accused of selling out the court. There was also no means of knowing if the king was sincerely prepared to cooperate with the moderates. Louis dashed all their hopes by attempting to flee from Paris. Louis XVI was a devout man. He deeply regretted his acceptance of the civil constitution of the clergy, which offended his conscience. He decided to flee from Paris, where he felt restricted by the Constituent Assembly, to Lorraine on the border of Luxembourg, and put himself under the protection of the military commander of the area. He had hoped that from there, in a position of strength, he would be able to renegotiate with the Constituent Assembly the parts of the constitution of the clergy he disliked. Military action would, he hoped, be unnecessary, although the king was aware there was a danger that his flight might open up divisions and bring about civil war. Louis left Paris with his family on June 20, 1791. When he reached Versailles during the night of June 21st, he was recognized by the local postmaster and stopped. He was brought back to Paris in an atmosphere of deathly silence. Louis's younger brother, the Comte de Provence, was luckier than the king. He also fled from Paris on June 20th with his wife, but he arrived safely in Brussels the next day. The flight to Varennes was one of the key moments of the early phase of the French Revolution. Before leaving, Louis had drawn up a proclamation to the French people, which set out in great detail his true feelings regarding the developments that had taken place. Writing in third person, he concluded that the king does not think it would be possible to govern so large and important a kingdom as France by the means established by the National Assembly. In the Declaration, it is obvious that Louis had failed to understand the popularity of the changes which had taken place in 1789. It also became clear that once again the French people would have to make choices that many of them would have preferred to avoid. Louis in his declaration had emphatically renounced the revolution. Could he continue to remain as head of state? Also, the credibility of the new constitution was undermined before it had even been implemented. Support for the republic started to grow while the popularity of the king declined. On June 24th, 30,000 people marched to the National Assembly in support of a petition from the Cordelier Club calling for the king's dismissal from office. One immediate result of the flight was that the king lost what remained of his popularity, which had depended on his being seen to support the revolution. Royal inn signs and street names disappeared overnight. His flight persuaded many who had supported him that he could no longer be trusted. People started to talk openly of replacing the monarchy with a republic. The deputies in the assembly acted calmly in this situation. They did not want a republic. They feared that the declaration of a republic would lead to civil war in France and to war with European monarchs. Nor did they want to concede victory to the radicals, who wanted more democratic policies. On July 16th, the Assembly voted to suspend the king until a constitution was completed. Governing without the head of state would encourage those who favored republicanism. He would be restored only after he had sworn to observe it. This was going too far for some deputies. 290 abstained from voting as a protest. For others, suspension did not go far enough. After the flight, radicals were appalled when the king was not dethroned or put on trial. Their anger was directed against the Constituent Assembly, which they claimed no longer represented the people. The Cordeliers took the lead with popular societies and persuaded the Jacobins to join them in supporting a petition for the king's deposition. This split the Jacobin Club, those who did not want the king deposed, and this included nearly all the members who were deputies, left the club. They set up a new club with a movement that had control of the assembly. Robespierre remained as leader of a small group of radical members. It seemed as though the Jacobins had destroyed themselves. However, only 72 of the provincial Jacobin clubs in France defected from the control of the Parisian club, and most of these drifted back in the next few months. On July 17, 1791, 50,000 people flocked to the Champ de Mars, a huge field in Paris where the Feast of the Federation, celebrating the fall of the Bastille, had been held 3 days previously. They were there to sign a republic petition for the Altar of the Fatherland. This was a political demonstration by the poorer sections of the Paris population. The Commune, under pressure from the Assembly, declared martial law. They sent Lafayette with the National Guard to the Champ de Mars, where the guards fired on the peaceful and unarmed crowd. About 50 people were killed. This was the first bloody clash between different groups in the Third Estate, and it was greeted with pleasure in the Assembly. Messages of support for the Assembly poured in from the provinces. Martial law remained in force for a month, during which some of the popular leaders were arrested. Others, such as Hebert, Marat, and Danton, fled or went into hiding. The moderates had won. It took nearly a year for the popular movement to recover and could now work out a compromise with the king without facing a mob violence. As far as the extremists were concerned, only the overthrow of the monarchy would satisfy their demands. The acceptance of the Constitution by the King on September 13, 1791, marked the end of the Constituent Assembly. Its final meeting was on September 30th. On October 1st, the first meeting of the new Legislative Assembly was held, but by now suspicion and hatred among the deputies had replaced the optimism of 1789. The mood among the deputies in the new Legislative Assembly was far from cooperative. There were a number of reasons why this change had come about. First, the king's reluctance to accept measures he disliked, suspicions regarding the king's commitment to the revolution as revealed by his flight, and also the fear of counter-revolutionary plots. To prevent his political opponents in the Constituent Assembly from dominating this new assembly, Robespierre proposed a self-denying ordinance. This was passed and stated that no member of the Constituent Assembly, including Robespierre, could sit in the next Legislative Assembly. From the very start, the Legislative Assembly were worried about non-juring clergy and by émigrés, whose numbers had greatly increased since the flight of the king. Nearly all the ancient regime bishops and many of the great court and parliamentary families had fled to Austria and the small German states along the river of the Rhine. What alarmed the Assembly most was the desertion of army officers. By early 1791, 1,200 noble officers had joined the émigrés, though a large majority of pre-revolutionary officers remained at their posts. All this changed after the king's flight. By the end of 1791, about 6,000 had emigrated, 60% of all officers. The Assembly passed two laws in November. One declared that all non-jurors were suspect. The other said that all émigrés who did not return to France by January 1st, 1792, would forfeit their property and be regarded as traitors. When the king vetoed these laws, his unpopularity increased. He appeared to be undermining the revolution. Some reforms were made and passed by this assembly, and they also dealt with this increasing politicalization, but the problem was the king. His distaste for what was happening within France and to his authority became evident during his attempt to flee the country. Whatever assurances he might give to the contrary, he was clearly ill at ease in the role of a constitutional monarch. His opponents, for their part, were uncomfortable with him, as the growth of republicanism would indicate.